Hello and welcome to Power Test 24 conference hosted by NITA. I'm Ellen Parson, the editor-in-chief of EC&M magazine, and I'm here in Dallas for the two-day event to learn everything I can about electrical power safety and reliability. This is Terry Becker. He is an electrical safety specialist with T.W. Becker Electrical Safety Consulting, Inc. Terry, thanks so much for sitting down with me and discussing this.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And we're going to go over the key takeaways from your presentation today, which was entitled, "What is my residual risk level?" So you start out with a hierarchy pyramid for assessing and minimizing risk. And at the bottom of that is PPE, which I guess kind of surprised me, but I'm not, the technical person, which you characterize as least effective. So could you explain why that's the case?
So
let's start with that.
If you look at the hierarchy of risk control methods that are documented in ANSI Z10 in the US or CSA Z462 in Canada and in 70E and Z462, the highest priority is elimination. Because that's the most effective way to get the worker not exposed to electric shock and arc flash.
Right.
But PPE will be required, but we haven't eliminated the hazard. So the hierarchy, wants elimination first.
Okay.
And if we can't eliminate and lock out, tag out, or what's called established and electrically safe work condition, then we need lower order controls, lower order on the priority to least effective, which is the PPE.
Okay.
Because electric shock and arc flash PPE could still result in a residual injury, right? So PPE doesn't guarantee zero harm residually, right? So that's why it's also the least effective. We haven't eliminated, and you can still get an injury if you're exposed to specifically arc flash.
And that makes sense. But maybe a lot of people new to the industry don't think of it that way. They think, I have to wear the PPE and that's going to protect me.
Well, it will, but again, back to the hierarchy of risk controls, which is elimination first, then engineering substitution, engineering safety by design, right? Then warning signs and barricading, then administrative controls, training and procedures, and then PPE.
Wow, okay.
So those higher level, those five other hierarchy of risk controls is what the employer needs to consider before they purchase and provide PPE. And OSHA in the States and OH&S regulations in Canada would want that hierarchy applied by the employer.
Okay, well, perfect. Thanks for explaining that. What are some of the most important questions our readers and listeners, electrical professionals, should ask when it comes to just general risk assessment?
So risk assessment, and I find that this is a gap in NFPA 70E training in the US and CSA Z462 training in Canada. Because you mentioned Article 1, 10.5, and in Canada it's Clause 4.1, right, that has this within subclauses or subarticles, the requirement for a risk assessment procedure, right? So that's supposed to happen, right? But I think what happens is workers are trained to do a shock risk assessment, an electric shock risk assessment, or an arc flash risk assessment, and they think that's the risk assessment procedure.
Oh, okay.
But it's not.
Makes sense. Okay.
So based on, again, risk assessment standards, right, and ANSI Z10 for the US is an occupational health and safety management system standard that includes risk, the employer has to consider potential severity of injury or damage to health and like of occurrence. The actual electric shock risk assessment and arc flash risk assessment only deliver some of the controls we need.
Right.
Boundaries, which is administrative, and then PP selection, which is a lower order hierarchy of risk controls. So a true risk assessment will look at the hierarchy and then with a process, a qualitative risk assessment, decide what controls will be applied. And it has to be work task based. So there's another sort of thing I don't think is industry keys in on is that 70E is a work task-based standard that requires a risk assessment, right? But electrical hazard identification and risk assessment against a discrete energized electrical work task.
Wow. So when you go into these firms, I'm sure you see that and they don't understand that, they're not really interpreting that. So then you're educating them on these gaps.
So what I find is that they're just saying, hey, the worker is going to execute this energized work.
Yeah.
They'll do this electric shock risk assessment and arc flash risk assessment. I say, well, no, you got to back up from that. And as the employer, you have to do a qualitative risk assessment as the employer. And what I recommend is you have an electrical safety committee between supervision of workers and safety, right? And then as a committee, you look at what work tasks do we perform in our workplace, right? What worker roles will perform it, right? And then we do this risk assessment to determine what hierarchy of risk controls we're going to apply at our workplace. Elimination being the highest priority, but then gets us all the way down to PPE with the worker doing that electric shock risk assessment and that arc flash risk assessment based on an energized electrical work task or work tasks that they'll identify that they might have to perform.
Okay. Now, I think that's another question. Our readers and viewers, they think, like, what is the responsibility of the employee versus the responsibility of the employer? So I'm sure you get that a lot. So the standard requires that the employer develop and implement the electrical safety program and document a risk assessment procedure. So is this all up to the employer, or what are the responsibilities of employee versus employer? You can probably talk for an hour on that.
I'm sort of smiling a little bit because that question comes up often.
Yeah.
Often I'll be doing arc flash and shock training, and the employee, the student who's an employee says, "This is the employer's responsibility. This is my supervisor's responsibility." And I tell them, "No, it's not. OSHA regulations require that the employer has some overarching higher level responsibility. But as the employee, you have to participate."
Okay, so is that a common misperception?
It is.
It's just like, oh, it's the employer.
It's the
they
employer's
didn't tell
responsibility.
me.
They just tell me, no, sorry. It's a shared role and responsibility. This is also documented in NFPA 70E in Article 110 and in Canada in Z462 Clause 4.1. But OSHA also includes that shared role and responsibility. So the employer does have a higher level of sort of responsibility from a liability perspective, but the employee shares liability as well, because if the company has an electrical safety program, which is really what they need, then they dictate policy. And then now there's a policy. I train the employee on the policy. If they don't follow the policy, they're going to accept some liability. Right? So the employer's done their part. We've now given you some additional information in this electrical safety program, what your role is, what you're supposed to do and not what you're supposed to do, when you need an energized electrical work permit, when you need an energized electrical job safety planning form. And we bought all this PPE for you, this electric shock and arc flash PPE, and then we give it to you. And then if you neglect to use it, the word neglect is a term used in unfortunate litigation, then you'll be liable. So it's important that employees know that they share some responsibility.
That is such a great point. Everyone does need to listen to that, because I think sometimes that gets lost.
It is lost.
So I think, do you have any final words of wisdom? I think we're about ready to wrap this up, or best practices for the audience just looking to improve their risk control methods and protocols. I know that's not like an easy thing you can just say in a nutshell, but any best practices?
I'll come back to my presentation at this year's conference. I titled it, "What is your residual risk level?" So it's consistent with some of the things we've been talking about, where the employee, and I actually say, I need you to own this. You are responsible for your safety. The employer will provide you support, but you ultimately make the decision. And a qualified person, which could be at multiple trades, right? Journey person electrician, HVAC, overhead door crane mechanic, elevator mechanic, doing energized diagnostics, or doing isolation, which involves testing for absence, which is energized work. It's up to you to control your residual risk level. So receive the training and apply it. Receive the PP. Don't complain about wearing it. Wear it.
And
know what your risk know that your risk is controlled by you, and your residual risk is as low as reasonably practicable. So there's some risk language here. There's no zero risk, but we can get the residual risk down to as this. And we do that by applying all those controls, including that lower order control of electric shock, arc flash, PP tools and equipment. So the message is, understand what your residual risk is and be able to prove it and believe it. And believe it.
That is great advice. I think that's really good to end on and wrap up our conversation. So Terry, thank you so much for talking with me today. And I'm Ellen Parson, Editor-in-Chief of ECNM at Power Test 24 in Dallas. Thank you and have a great day.